Welcome to a recording webinar between Colorado Cross Disability Coalition and Colorado Access. The title of this webinar is The New Full Benefit Dual Eligible Population. Our presenter today is Julie Reiskin. Julie Reiskin is the Executive Director of the Colorado Cross Disability Coalition. And under Julie's leadership, CCDC has taken a leadership role within Colorado on publicly funded long-term health care. Julie has proposed and helped to implement many solutions to create a sustainable and client-friendly Medicaid program, acted as a respected advocate for individuals, and has trained many others in the health advocacy and health policy. So the agenda for this webinar is that we will go over the pre-survey results. We will find out who are the people with Medicare and Medicaid dual eligibility. How are people with Medicare and Medicaid dual eligibility different from other Medicaid populations? What are the expectation and service needs? And review the Americans with Disabilities Act Olmstead decision. And with that, I turn it over to Julie.
Thank you, Glenda. Before we recorded this webinar, we did a survey of the intended participants. So based on the survey results, this webinar is addressing the top areas of identified need, which is primarily explaining who are the people with Medicare and Medicaid eligibility and what are their needs. There was also a lot of interest in the requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act, particularly as it applies to health care. So we're going to start by talking about who are people with Medicare and Medicaid dual eligibility. And there's four primary groups that we're going to talk about today. People in their early 60s, young people on a parental record, we'll talk about what that means, low-income seniors, and individuals on long-term services and supports. So first we'll talk about people who are in their early 60s. These are folks that might be getting on Medicare through early retirement, or they may be on Social Security disability, but they're not the typical people with disabilities that you're used to seeing in the Medicaid system. They often will have medical problems, but that do not rise to the traditional level of disability, or they do not meet long-term care eligibility, meaning they will not appear to have problems with activities of daily living. They will have work histories, but the history may be spotty. The work histories might include someone who took a lot of time off to raise a family and maybe worked before and after that. It might include people that have worked jobs that were more cash-based. There may be people that have worked on and off. Some of these folks will have had lifelong disabilities, but have never been identified as such. And then they get older and maybe bodies wear out and they're not able to work anymore. So they end up in the system. This population tends to have more psychosocial issues. There may be multiple problems such as family issues. There may be multiple generations living together. They're often caregiving, young grandparents caregiving, and sometimes there will be substance abuse issues. Again, these are big generalizations, so this is certainly not meant to be definitive of everyone in this situation. There are some taking early retirement because they really do need disability, but they're unable to qualify, mostly because the process is so difficult to get disability under Social Security. And they're rarely going to have private disability plans or even private retirement plans. The reason why this group is now going to come into the Medicaid-Medicare dual eligibility system is because they would have been just on Medicare in the past. The Affordable Care Act will increase the number of people eligible for Medicaid in Colorado because we have expanded Medicaid to up to 138% of poverty, which is roughly around $15,000, a little under $15,000 a year for one person. On the other end of the spectrum, are young people who are getting disability based on their parental work record. So what it means is Social Security provides full benefits, cash benefits under the Social Security Disability Insurance Program for people who have a disability that appeared before age 18 based on a work record of a parent who has died, become disabled, or retired. The acronym for this is called DAC, Disabled Adult Children. Some people come into the system that way. Others migrate from Supplemental Security Income, which is SSI. So the reason these folks are dual eligible is, particularly when they migrate from SSI, is SSI automatically guarantees you Medicaid in the state of Colorado and in many other states. When someone has SSI, which is a little over $700 a month, and they become a DAC, a disabled adult child, their income will generally increase. They'll get a Social Security disability benefit. Sometimes that might be as low as $200 or $300 a month, and they'll still get SSI to bring them up to that $700 level. But often it's going to be much more. It's going to be $800, $900, even $1,100, $1,200, up to $1,500 sometimes a month, depending on how much the parent earned. There's a law that says when that happens, the person gets to keep their Medicaid forever as long as they remain disabled under a category that they call SSI related. So these are folks that will not have a work record because they've become disabled as a child. They generally will have developmental disabilities or psychiatric disabilities, and there will be some level of psychosocial issue because they've often lost a major support system or at least had a disruption with the parent generally having died or becoming disabled. It's fairly rare for the young people to have parents retiring while they're still young, but that certainly can happen. But again, generally in this category, you're going to find young people who had a parent die or become disabled at a fairly young age. There also, in some cases, may be generational disabilities, such as mental illness, where disability does tend to run in the family. Low-income senior citizens is another group that you'll find in this category. These are a senior citizen that has Medicare, as almost every senior has, but their income is low enough for them to qualify for Medicaid. And there are two ways that can happen. Some are long-term disabled, or they might be disabled, have significant disabilities, where they were on long-term care before they turned 65. And they are aging into Medicare, but they've been on long-term care Medicaid, usually in a home and community-based services waiver, occasionally in a nursing facility. They've been on Medicaid for many years. Sometimes they might have come on as low-income seniors, and they age into full Medicare, Medicaid, or they may have been on 10 years, 20 years. The two people in this picture, one person was injured in the 70s when he was a very young man, the guy. The woman is someone who had a stroke in her 40s and is now 65. So it can be any of those situations. It also now, particularly with the Affordable Care Act, can be just simple low-income seniors who don't have disabilities but often have health issues. People who are low-income and they get to be a senior citizen are almost always going to have some sort of health issue just because of the intersection between poverty and health problems. Again, this is not certainly 100% true, but you're often going to find in this population that these are generational blue-collar hard workers. These are people that take a lot of pride in work. They're people that have worked very hard to get themselves and their families out of poverty, and accepting Medicaid might be a challenge for some of these folks. And finally, you have young people with disabilities, and also this could also include seniors, but primarily younger people with disabilities who are eligible for Medicaid and Medicare because they need long-term services and supports. These are people with disabilities who have work experience, and the reason why the work experience piece is important is that that's how you get the Medicare under 65, is through SSDI, Social Security Disability Insurance. If you have SSDI and you also require home and community-based services, meaning you need assistance with activities of daily living, and your income is under 3 times SSI, so under about $2,100, you're eligible for Medicaid through the Home and Community-Based Services Program. So these are folks that have a work history, and some may be working. Because we now have a Medicaid ban for working adults with disabilities that allows people to earn even more and buy into Medicaid and pay a premium, there are going to be more and more people in this category that are returning to work. People have a work history, they become disabled, they require long-term care, and now because we have had this new option for a little over a year, there are more and more people returning to work. There's some folks that never left the workplace and have been working and have a work history. And of course, some of the folks in this category will no longer be working and are not interested or able to go back to work. So that's a pretty wide variety of folks. Now we're going to have a little reflection here. So we're going to go through and look at which of these clients are likely to be a client with dual eligibility. So we'll start with Joe. Joe is 68 and he has a spinal cord injury. So let's say he's paralyzed from the chest down. And he got that injury when he was at age 32. So is he likely to be a client with dual eligibility? And the answer is yes. He's one of those low-income seniors who would have aged into Medicare and Medicaid. Depending on whether he had a strong work history when he was injured would depend on if he would have had SSDI at the time or SSI. Someone who was injured that long ago likely would have had both SSI and SSDI because the time would have eroded the SSDI benefit so that it probably would be under that $700 amount. So very likely someone in this situation would be on both Medicare and Medicaid because someone with that level spinal cord injury would need assistance with activities of daily living. An exception might be if the person had assets that made them ineligible for Medicaid. Very unusual for someone with that level of disability to be able to maintain assets, so that's pretty unlikely. Now let's move to Sarah. Sarah's 26 and she's a single parent with depression. She works part-time as a waitress. So she's not likely to be a client with dual eligibility. If she's working part-time as a waitress, she is likely not going to qualify for Social Security disability insurance or SSI, Supplemental Security Income. While she does have a disability, it says that she's working, which would likely disqualify her from those programs. If her income is low enough, she certainly may be eligible for Medicaid under the expanded eligibility through the Affordable Care Act, but it's also unlikely that she would have had enough work credits to even get her an SSDI benefit, even if she did qualify to make that, to get you the dual eligibility. It's important to understand the work connection for most people, that you have to have enough of a work history to be able to get that disability insurance to be a dual eligible, with some exceptions, such as C. Tim is 24 and has schizophrenia. He lives independently, and his mother died when he was 16. This is someone who is likely to have dual eligibility, even though he does not have a work history, or unlikely to have a work history. Schizophrenia really affects particularly males in their late teens, sometimes a little younger than that, and so it's unlikely that someone would have had a work history at that age with a disability as severe as schizophrenia. However, his mother died when he was 16. Assuming that his schizophrenia appeared before he was 18, which is a pretty good assumption, he probably would be getting the DAC, the Disabled Adult Child Benefit, and because of the severity of schizophrenia, would also qualify for Medicaid, probably through a long-term care program. Now, this last one is a little bit of a trick. Kevin is 44 and a quadriplegic. He's a practicing attorney and has been the same job for 15 years. This is someone who would likely be only on Medicaid, on Medicare and Medicaid. The reason for that is that when someone goes back to work using a work incentive program, they eventually will get off of all cash benefits. Once you are off of all of your cash benefits, even if you had SSDI, you have 7 years and then you lose your Medicare. Because of Medicaid buy-in and some other work incentive programs that apply to SSI, you never lose your Medicaid, and Medicaid is really the more important benefit for young adults with disabilities. So someone like this would have been a dual eligible and then lost their Medicare but stayed Medicaid. If someone like this becomes unable to work for either a long or short period of time and goes back into the disability system and goes back and gets SSDI again, they would then, after 2 years, become Medicare and Medicaid again. But as long as there's been that long, more than 7 years of work, they're going to be unlikely to still be a dual eligible. I know this is very confusing, and the point of this wasn't to make people understand all of the intricacies of Medicare and Medicaid eligibility, but to understand that there are certain types of people you're going to run into that are different from the traditional Medicaid population. To review, people with Medicare and Medicaid are a little bit different from the people that traditionally have been served in the Colorado Medicaid population, which are people with SSI, Supplemental Security Income, based on the following reasons. They've got a work history. People on SSI do not have a work history, or they don't have a strong work history. They generally, people with dual eligibility generally, are not coming from generational poverty. People on SSI may or may not come from generational poverty, but are certainly more likely to have come from that. In the Social Security world, there's a big difference between Social Security disability insurance and SSI. So Social Security disability insurance is insurance. It is not welfare, quote unquote, and it's not an entitlement. It is treated, and people are treated as if it is an insurance policy. It's something you pay into. What you get out is directly related to what you put in. So people with higher incomes get higher amounts. SSI, like most entitlement programs, is not based on what you put in, but it's based solely on your need and your poverty, and everyone more or less gets the same amount, or at least there's a cap, and they assume everyone should end up with that same amount, whether it's all SSI or part SSI. The other thing that's important to know about people with Medicare and Medicaid is, particularly when you're on Medicare, it's very likely that you've gone 2 or more years without health care. Medicaid is given to people the minute they get SSI, sometimes even retroactively. Medicare is not given to people with SSDI. They have to wait 2 years from the date that they were determined disabled. The reason for that is funny. This program was started many, many years ago, and in those days the wisdom was that everyone has at least a couple years of savings. And so that's why that rule is there, and it literally would take an act of Congress and a lot of money to change that. So that will change with the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, but right now you're going to see people that have gone years without health care, and that drives how you feel about health care. People have very different health care behaviors who had to go without it for a long time. They certainly take it a lot more seriously and are a lot more appreciative of having health care after going without it. They also, unfortunately, will have pent-up needs and often have developed secondary health problems as a result of not being able to get health care for several years. A couple exceptions. There are always exceptions to these rules. Young people on parental record may not have had work experience, often will have had childhood onset, well, by nature will have had childhood onset disabilities, or at least teenage onset disabilities. And the other exception is that there are people with SSI that have successfully used work incentive programs to earn work quarters, and so not everyone on SSI is long-term poverty, and there are people in the SSI categories that may be doing very well and well into a career. Again, if they return to the disability system for any reason, they will receive SSDI and become a dual eligible after 24 months. However, there's a lot of similarities too. People with Medicare and Medicaid dual eligibility are also very similar to people on SSI and the disability population that has been in the Medicaid world for many years. The similarities include we all want to control our own lives. Relative to the broader Medicaid population, the disability group has relatively more complex medical needs, and both communities or populations require both medical and non-medical supports. And we'll talk about what that is in a couple of slides here. So, to reflect, which characteristic here make it more difficult for many people with dual eligibility to participate in Medicaid? A, work history. B, no previous experience with an entitlement system. C, cultural differences. Or D, a heavy reliance on family instead of government. Well, the answer to that is B, no previous experience with an entitlement system. And what that means is when you've never been in an entitlement system, you've never had to, for example, justify your assets. You've never had to tell people what you have in the bank account at any given time, and you haven't really had to think about were you going over a certain amount, and you haven't been asked about property. Did you own property? Have you given away property? There's certain things in entitlement programs that may have very legitimate policy goals, but they can feel intrusive, and a lot of people feel like they're being kind of interrogated when they start being asked these questions. So especially if you have someone who's adjusting to a new disability, their whole life has changed, they may have a great sense of loss, and now they might feel like they're being asked to give up the last bit of privacy and dignity they have. It can be really challenging. And unfortunately, often at the time when people most need it is when it's going to be hardest to accept it. And so that's just something to keep in mind if you're working with this population, to try and let them know that while it's hard, these benefits can be really important and can help people maintain their independence and control, particularly the home and community-based services programs. What expectations do people with disabilities have, or should they have? Particularly the people that are working and that are still in the workforce or going back to the workforce, or people that have made sure to stay in the workforce to some degree. Different than a population that has been historically more isolated and oppressed, they're going to have a higher expectation to be treated as equals. They're going to want to use doctors and providers as a consultant rather than going in and expecting the doctor or provider to be the expert and tell them what to do. People that are working are generally going to need evening and weekend access to use services. That, of course, people work different shifts, and some people are working part-time or have flexible hours. But for full-time professionals, they're going to need weekend and evening access. They're also going to be more interested and able to do a lot more electronically. They're not going to be afraid of electronic applications such as our PEAK system. They're going to want to do more with email. And they're going to be a lot more sophisticated about their information. And this is important when you're talking about working in relationships with medical providers. Is unlike the SSI population, this population is going to come in with ideas about medications, and they will have read articles. It's not just watching a 30-second spot on TV. They will have done some research. And that's going to be much more similar to a commercial population than to the traditional Medicaid population that hadn't had that kind of access in the past. When people, providers, professionals are not used to working with that, sometimes people can be a little taken aback and feel maybe even put off by that and feel that people are coming in making demands and saying, you have to give me this medication. And that's not at all what they're doing. They're coming in having taken responsibility for their health care, having done some research with ideas. And you should treat them that way and treat them as if, again, they're professionals, that you're a consultant, and encourage that, because there's all kinds of research coming out showing that engaged patients that do this kind of research have much better health outcomes. We need to be working on how to bring the rest of the disability community, the SSI population, the people that are less willing to do this and less willing to speak up, how to engage them to have them do more of this rather than to stop people that are taking this kind of responsibility and taking this kind of responsibility and having this strong level of engagement from having that. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the kinds of services in general that this very broad, big population might need and want. When we're talking about medical services, traditional acute medical services, this population is, again, it's a very large population, is going to want both alternative and traditional services. This population is definitely going to need the regular, doctor, hospital, therapy, medication kinds of services. And depending on the age range, but particularly with the younger baby boomers and the working disabled, they're going to be much more interested in alternative care, such as chiropractic, even such as deep breathing. They're going to want to do pain control with a variety of methods. They're not going to want to just take pills, but they're also not going to want to not have any kind of pain management either, especially as they're working. So they're going to want to blend the two, and they're going to be much more open than previous populations to blending the two. The people that have been in the workforce will likely have had experience with alternative providers, whereas long-term SSI clients will not have had that kind of experience for the most part. In terms of their long-term services, and by long-term services, we're talking personal care, home health, the services that are provided in home and community-based services waivers, but anything that you need really forever, and these services are both medical and non-medical services. The baby boomers definitely are a generation is going to be very much focused on control, and there's a reason for that, a really good reason for that. And we'll talk about that in just in the very next slide. But they're going to expect and demand a lot more control over their services and their lives than previous disability groups have, and certainly than previous senior populations have had. They're going to see care coordination as a partnership. They're going to see a care coordinator as a consultant, hopefully as an ally. It's going to be important to have clear parameters when you use the term care coordination, because that term is all over the place and it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. In terms of social services, again, particularly the young disabled that are working, are not going to need the same kinds of social services as the SSI population. They're not going to qualify for food stamps or LEAP, and they're not going to qualify for most of the poverty-related programs. The seniors will qualify and need the same types of programs that senior citizens have always needed and used, including the people in their 60s, such as the AAAs, the Meals on Wheels. But the younger disabled are going to want more services such as employment-related assistance. How do I keep my job? What do I do when I'm having a disability-related problem at my job? How do I ask for an accommodation on the job? And also financial planning. What do I do if I accumulate assets and I make it to 65 when the Medicaid buy-in program ends? How do I set myself up for a reasonable future? This is particularly true for people that are just going back to work and moving off of the entitlement systems to more of the insurance systems, and maybe in their 40s or 50s. So financial planning is going to be a very strong need. And then employment, and even for the younger folks, looking at employment-related issues. What can I do? What should I do? How do I maintain my disability status? That's going to be a big question. In terms of mental health, again, like any population, there's going to be a certain number of these folks, again, particularly with the disabled adult children, people in their early 60s that have serious mental illnesses and are going to need appropriate mental treatment for that. However, the other groups, and really all of the groups, but particularly the disabled adults and the seniors who age into Medicare, and people with disabilities that are now seniors, which is a new group, are going to need life adjustment counseling. These are all people that have had a big adjustment in their life. Either they've acquired a disability or they've become senior citizens. And this is the first cohort, the people that are alive right now today that are aging into Medicare with disabilities are the first group ever to have done that as a real population. It's only now that people with disabilities, with lifelong disabilities, are living to be in their 70s. That has never ever happened before. Again, there have been rare cases of people that have lived a long time, but it's pretty new. And so there isn't a lot of information on aging with a disability. There isn't a lot of medical information about what does this look like, what should we expect. There certainly aren't enough people that have come before this group. So those are pretty big adjustments, and people's disabilities change a lot as they age. So now we're going to talk about control. We all want control of our lives. That's not unique about disability, and it's certainly not unique about seniors or really any age group. Everyone wants control over who comes in your home, who touches your body, who has access to every bit of your private life. For people who need help with activities of daily living, such as people who use home and community-based services, they want to have control over the people that provide those services. So what consumer direction and long-term services mean is that consumers can and should have options to choose the people that deliver their services. They should be able to manage the how, the when, the where of how the services are delivered, and they should be able to monitor the quality. When you're getting the services, you know what quality is. They also should be able to manage a budget. That doesn't mean decide what the budget's going to be. It means manage the budget. For example, to decide, if I have $100, do I want to pay someone 10 hours at $10 an hour, or do I want to pay them 5 hours at $20 an hour? Those kinds of decisions and this kind of control is the future of long-term care and long-term services, not just in Colorado but throughout the country. Colorado currently has 2 programs that are considered consumer direction programs in our long-term services and supports system. One is called the Consumer Directed Attendance Support Services, that's a mouthful, otherwise known as CDASS, C-D-A-S-S. In CDASS, a client, or you can have an authorized representative, which is anyone you want who's going to help you, manages the budget completely. The case manager and the client do an assessment which determines what the budget is, and that's based on your needs and what Medicaid covers. Then the client or authorized representative must go to a class, a training class, and pass a test to prove that they really understand all of the responsibilities in managing employees and managing and being responsible for the government money that's paying for this. They do work with a fiscal agent that's hired by the state of Colorado to make sure that taxes are paid and that all of the employment things are done right. But the client or their rep is completely responsible for recruitment, hiring, sometimes firing if necessary, managing their own quality, etc. They stay within their budget. They must ensure that they meet their needs, but outside of that, they can manage things the way they want. So if they need their care provider to meet them at work and help them in the middle of the day or time with personal stuff that they need in the middle of the day, that's fine. They don't have to stay in their home. And it's a very popular program with really excellent quality metrics. Another option for people that can't quite manage all of that is a program called In-Home Support Services. In that program, a client or an authorized rep works with a special kind of supportive agency, and the client still gets to select and supervise and choose their attendance, but the agency manages the budget. They also provide backup and other kinds of support. So if the client doesn't feel comfortable but they feel they need to fire someone, the agency will come in and do that and help the client as necessary. They also provide backup if the attendant gets sick, whereas in the consumer-directed attendance support service, the client is responsible for backup. So the future directions for consumer direction overall in the Medicaid program is that there will be a true continuum of direction and control, not just a couple of options. That all waiver services, meaning all services that are considered long-term care, will be eligible to be provided in this model. Consumer direction is not a program, it's a delivery option. So for example, right now we can only get personal care, homemaker, and health maintenance services using the consumer direction model. Eventually you'll be able to get transportation, assisted living, adult day, any long-term care service you'll be able to get via a consumer-directed model. In the future, all clients, regardless of their disability type or eligibility category, will be eligible to use consumer-directed models. Currently, it's not available to all clients. It's only available to some. And there's also a recognized need for increased supports and options for authorized representatives, knowing that many people can't do this 100% on their own, but should be able to get some support to have as much control as possible. Control and choice are very important values in Colorado and probably around the country, and something that the baby boomers are just going to demand on a national level. So, for a reflection, consumer direction means A, is it a voucher for Medicaid clients to purchase private insurance? B, is it allowing clients to have greater say in choosing which provider agency they use? C, is it a delivery model whereby clients make decisions of who will provide what care in what setting within a specific budget? Or D, is it a specific HCBS waiver for Medicaid? The answer, of course, is C. It's a delivery model where clients make decisions of who will provide what care in what settings within a specified budget. The last section of this webinar is going to be to talk about the Olmstead decision. The Olmstead decision is a Supreme Court decision that implemented a section of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this decision required every state to provide services in the most integrated setting appropriate to the needs of the individual. Now, most integrated is a stronger standard than what we've heard in the past. We used to say less restrictive or least restrictive environment. The most integrated setting is measured by how much interaction someone has with people without disabilities. So how integrated are you? Are you able to live, work, play, worship in the same kinds of settings that other people have, other people of your cohort, of your age group? So what's integrated for someone who's 85 might be different than what's integrated for someone who's 40. The Supreme Court in the Olmstead decision said that states must modify their policies, practices, and procedures in order to provide services in the most integrated setting, unless making such a modification would create a fundamental alteration of a program benefit service. The Supreme Court said that states must make sure that services are provided in the most integrated setting appropriate. Now, they don't have to provide services at all, but when the state or local government provides any kind of service, not just Medicaid, any kind of service, they must make sure that it's set up so that people with disabilities can be served in the most integrated setting that's appropriate. So who determines what's appropriate? Well, the Supreme Court said it's determined by quote-unquote treating professionals. That often means your doctor, but it could mean your social worker. It could mean any professional that is treating and working with the client or the individual. Supreme Court also said that this applies to all disability types, that this is about the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Americans with Disabilities Act defines disability as a substantial limitation in a major life activity. So it can be, this applies to people with physical disabilities, psychiatric disabilities, intellectual disabilities, all disabilities. The Supreme Court gave the states some choices, though, of how they implement it. So states may, they can choose to have a plan or not. The Department of Justice did say states without a plan probably aren't going to do too well if there's a lawsuit, but they don't have a plan. They're just encouraged to do so. It also said that states are allowed to have a waiting list for services, that they don't have to serve everyone immediately, but the wait list does need to move at a reasonable pace. And there's a lot of debate over what that is, what a reasonable pace means. The Supreme Court also acknowledged that states do not have unlimited resources, that money does sometimes have to come into play here. But it did focus on discussion about how services for one group of people with disabilities would or would not affect services for other groups of people with disabilities. It also said that it's also come up in litigation that states generally cannot use budget as a sole defense. They can't refuse to modify a policy or refuse to integrate people only talking about money and nothing else. Because the Supreme Court or the Department of Justice, whoever's looking at it, is going to look at the overall funding of the entire state, not just one line item in their budget. So I'm going to go over a couple true or false on the Olmstead decision. Does the Olmstead decision require states to cease admissions to nursing homes? No, it doesn't. It said that the states can have institutions. They just have to make sure that people are offered a community-based option if that's what they want, and if that's what's determined appropriate for the individual. Is it true or false that the Olmstead decision requires states to make exceptions to some rules if doing so will enable someone to live in the community? Absolutely. That's exactly what it says. Does the Olmstead decision require states to make exceptions to all rules if doing so will enable someone to live in the community? No, that's not true. Again, states have a process, states and local governments must have a process to determine if making the rule change would be a fundamental alteration of the program, and if it is, they don't have to do it because they're not expected to fundamentally change what they're doing. Is it true or false that the Olmstead decision applies to people with all types of disabilities? That is absolutely true. And finally, is it true or false that the Olmstead decision allows states to have a strict cost containment requirement? For example, to say anyone whose care costs more than X dollar amount is not going to get services in the community. Absolutely not. There has to be an individual determination, and states can consider budget but cannot use that as a sole defense. So getting into what is a reasonable modification of policy. Usually you think rules are rules, right? So why would you modify one? Well, Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act applies to state and local government and any contractor of state and local government. What they said is that discrimination includes a failure to make a reasonable modification to a policy, a practice, or a procedure when doing so would avoid discrimination. Now remember, keeping someone in a segregated setting and having someone be isolated is considered discrimination by the Supreme Court under this decision. And integration is measured by activity with non-disabled people. So, it is not required. You do not have to make a modification if it would cause a fundamental alteration of the program, service, or benefit. And what that means is if it would change it so much that it's really unrecognizable or change a fundamental aspect. But the state must have a process to make an individualized determination. And when I say state, I'm talking about the state or local or anyone who contracts with the state. So how do you make these determinations? The first thing that has to happen is an individual has to express a need. Now, that doesn't mean that they have to say, according to, 28 CFR, Section 35-130, Section D7, I'm asking for reasonable modification of policy, practice, and procedure under the Americans with Disabilities Act. They don't have to do that. They can simply say, I really want to get out of the nursing home, but I need to have a ramp. And the rule says that I can't get approval for the ramp unless I'm out of the nursing home. Well, that doesn't work. So they just have to express a need, and that's enough to be considered a request. They need to be a qualified individual with a disability. Well, most of the people that or in the Medicaid system already are considered qualified individuals with a disability. What this means is that if you're not qualified, for example, if you're not qualified for Medicaid for some other reason, your assets are too high, or maybe you're not a citizen, you can't then ask Medicaid to make a reasonable modification of their policy. Most of the people that this webinar was geared to are people for whom that qualification decision has already been made. Whoever's in charge needs to know if they understand the request, and the way you do that is by talking to the individual involved. So the choice is, once you understand the request, is you can do two things. You can either approve the request and make it happen, or if you don't feel like you can do that for whatever reason, you enter into an interactive process with the individual or their representative, which might be a family member, an advocate, a guardian, or a friend. And the interactive process is a fancy way of saying you talk to them, and you see if you can come up with a compromise that works for everyone. When you come up with a compromise, you ask, is this effective for the purpose? Then you want to evaluate. Don't just assume it's going to work. You want to check back in. But you don't ever want to get into a situation of having someone continually have to prove their need again and again. Some factors to consider when someone asks for a reasonable accommodation, because sometimes it's just going to be a modification of the procedure of how you do things. For example, someone with a communication impairment might need an extra 10 minutes when they have a doctor's appointment because they can't talk quickly. So the first factor is providing the requested accommodation something that might fit into your overall business practices anyway. A good example of this is reminder calls. That used to be a special thing that was done only for someone with memory problems, and it's becoming more and more a generic practice that all doctors' offices are doing because it helps them to avoid no-shows. Do you have a policy and procedure for responding to disability-related requests? Again, they're not all going to come in on a form or with the specific language, but it's still your obligation to be able to respond. So if there isn't one, we would strongly suggest that you create some policy and procedure for responding. And finally, if you're going to deny the request, have you analyzed and explored all possible alternatives? Most people are going to be very happy to talk, and if the request can't be met exactly the way they've asked, they're happy to work with you because what they really want is the end result, not the outcome that they're asking for, not a specific process. So let's look at what might be some examples of a reasonable modification of policy. Expediting the approval of a home and community-based service, like a RAMP, home modification, to facilitate transition out of a nursing facility. That's absolutely a reasonable modification of policy. You got to change what you're doing and maybe change the order to make it work, and there really isn't a way around it. What about waiver of an income or asset requirements to enable someone with a disability to qualify for Medicaid? Well, that isn't reasonable because that would be a fundamental alteration of the program, service, or benefit. Medicaid has very well-known income and asset requirements. Those change over time, usually based on law. And if someone is over income, for example, they can set up an income trust to bring themselves down to the income that Medicaid allows. There are options, but to just waive those requirements would fundamentally alter the program, and the states don't have to do that. Down to a medical practice example. A medical office allowing an additional 10 minutes for an appointment for an individual who takes more time to communicate. As we just said, that's a perfect example of a reasonable modification of a practice or procedure. A physician giving a home number for a patient to call any time of the day or night, of course that is completely unreasonable, and that would be a fundamental alteration and not something that would be expected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. In conclusion, the Americans with Disabilities Act is important and affects all aspects of your business, whether you're a doctor's office involved in case management or you're with the state and local government. The Olmstead decision is a Supreme Court decision that implements a part of the Americans with Disabilities Act, namely Title II, which is the section that applies to state and local government. And importantly, there are people available to help you with ADA compliance. There are resources in Colorado and around the country that can help you and that can answer questions and can talk these things through with you. So please don't make this something that's scary or uncomfortable, because there are lots of folks willing to help you out. If you need more information, you can feel free to contact us at any time. The Colorado Cross Disability Coalition, we're on the web at ccdconline.org, and our phone number is 303-839-1775. We've got a Facebook page. Thank you very much for listening to this webinar. Check back later for future topics.